Добрий день всім, з вами Ольга.
Hello, everyone. This is Olga Atamanov, and I welcome everyone who has joined us. It's been 110th day of the full-scale invasion of the Russian Federation to our country, and the 9th day of the heroic resistance of the Ukrainians. Media Center Ukraine in Ukrinform continues its operations, and today we have the following events planned. At 2 o'clock, we will talk about the completion of the sowing campaign in Ukraine in the times of war. We will have First Deputy Minister of Agrarian Policies and Food of Ukraine, Mr. Vysotsky, and Tatiana Damenko, the head of the Agrometeorology Department of the Meteor Service of Ukraine. Also at 2:30 we'll have Alexander Motyzaniak, the spokesperson of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. We'll talk about the operational situation at the front line. And now we have the International Legion of Ukraine's defense. And we'll talk about this unit, and we'll talk about the motivation of the international supporters who help us defend our land, and about the status of the POWs who are foreign nationals in the times of war. And I would like to introduce our guests. We have Damien Magrou, the Speaker of the International Legion of Ukraine's Defense, and Mr. Manchega, the military medic.
Hello, good afternoon everyone, and welcome to our very first press briefing, which I think might not become the last. So my name is Damien Magrou. As Olga introduced me, I'm spokesperson for the International Legion. I wanted to first talk about a topic that is very important for us, and that is the legal status of legionnaires under international law. You will all have followed the news concerning the three prisoners of war that have been put on trial in the so-called Donetsk People's Republic and have been handed down a death penalty judgment by the so-called Supreme Court of that so-called entity. For the sake of the record, I'd like to clarify that these three are not legionnaires. They all had contracts with the Ukrainian armed forces long before this war started, the full-on attack on Ukraine. Therefore, they were not legionnaires directly, but their case is very important and quite determining for us as legionnaires as well. As all of you will know, starting criminal proceedings against prisoners of war for their participation in hostilities goes against the Geneva Conventions, and we condemned in the strongest possible terms these violations of the Geneva Conventions that have been done by Russian forces and Russian proxies. That being said, once the case of these two British and one Moroccan national have been mentioned, it is important for us to underline once again the status as prisoner of war that legionnaires enjoy. This question is very current and very important for at least one legionnaire that we have made public previously. His name is Andrew Hill. He's been in captivity for 4 or 5 weeks already. And we do not know what his current status is. We do not know where he is. We do not know what kind of treatment he's being given. We do not know what the Russians and the Russian proxies are planning for him. And we're very concerned about this situation. We call very strongly on the Russian authorities and their proxies to treat Andrew Hill as a prisoner of war, as he is entitled under the Geneva Convention. Andrew Hill, like all other legionnaires, are full members of the Ukrainian armed forces, have a contract with the Ukrainian armed forces, and must be considered as prisoners of war under Article 4 of the Third Geneva Convention. So we'd like to repeat that and repeat our concern for Andrew Hill's situation. I'll keep going on the things that I wanted to talk about today, then I'll introduce our guest, and she will say a few things, and then we'll open the floor for questions. I hope that's okay for everyone. Another topic that I wanted to mention something about, and I feel the international community needs to hear about this, because there is a certain sense of complacency that seems to have fallen over our Western partners, that the arms deliveries that Ukraine has already been provided with are somehow enough to win the war. They are not. They do not come near anything that would be close to enabling us to defeat the Russians on the battlefield, especially in terms of long-range artillery. Our capacities are still far below that of Russian forces. And so it's very important for the international community, and particularly the populations of those countries that have been so kind as to support Ukraine since the beginning of the war, to realize that what has been sent, and obviously the Ukrainian armed forces, and I think the entire Ukrainian people, is very grateful for what has been sent already, but it's nowhere near enough, and we need your continued support. So please keep sending heavy artillery, heavy weapon system, long-distance rockets, anti-ship rockets, all of the things that the Ukrainian government has already made public are needed to replenish our arsenals. All of these things are needed today on the battlefield. Actually, they're needed yesterday. But the longer we wait, the more deaths there will be. And those deaths will include not only Ukrainian members of the armed forces, but also our legionnaires, and that's why I took up that topic today. There were two more questions I wanted to talk about, but I think actually our guest, Glenna Manchego, she's a sergeant and a combat medic in one of our units, currently fighting on the front in the Kharkiv region. I think she'll be better able than me to talk about the motivation of legionnaires and what achievements the Legion has had since its inception. So I'll give the floor over to her now, and I'll come back for questions if there are any. Thank you.
Дякую. Прошу, Глено.
Hello, everybody. My name is Glenna Manchego. I am from the United States, Utah, to be specific, if anybody knows where that is, famous for hiking and whatnot. I served as a medic in my military. I just got out of the military maybe about six months ago for my country. And I was sitting on the couch one day, and suddenly on the TV, I saw that Russia invaded Ukraine. And I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I couldn't think that this was humanly possible. And then next I saw Zelensky's call to the world and the world's warriors. If you come, we will arm you and you can fight with us. And I bought a ticket. I arrived here on April 1st. Was greeted at the border very graciously by the Ukrainian military, and trained, armed, like said, and was sent to the front line as a combat medic in the Kharkiv region. In Kharkiv, I've had the privilege of treating Ukrainian military in my ambulances, Legion, and civilians, and helping refugees get out. What I've seen out there is pure terror and evil from what the Russians can do. I didn't believe what a human could do to another human until I got there. But as for the motivation, everybody asks me, I mean, it's not my first interview, like, common question is, what motivated you to come? And it's hard to explain, but as I've talked to my fellow legionnaires, and what they'd wished me to say here is, we all heard a call, and we've heard the call before, because most of us have served in our own country's militaries, and it's a certain call. You volunteer to serve in your military, where I'm from, to protect your values, your country, all of this. But when we heard Zelensky's call, it was bigger. It was a bigger call. It was a call to the world, not just from my country. My country wasn't saying go and fight. But it's a call that we can't quite describe, but we were ready to answer it. That's me.
Дякую, Дам'єне. Скажіть, будь ласка, і наразі
Thank you. Damian, so the representatives of which countries are engaged in the international legion? Can I respond in Russian? Yeah, okay. Apologize. Just my Ukrainian is really not good. So we have representatives of over 50 countries and different nationalities. 55, I think, was the last figure, the last time I looked. We have representatives of all the parts of the world, all continents, even as far as Brazil, South Korea, Australia. But the majority of our legionnaires, mostly it's the US and the UK. After them we have the Poles and Canadians, a lot of Canadians with Ukrainian roots, as you probably know, and other nationalities. There are also a lot of people from the Baltic region and Nordic countries, quite a lot also from Finland. Thank you. Dear colleagues, your questions? Vitaly Golod from Ukrinform. My first question to Ms. Manchego. So you were the service person in your country. And the question to both speakers. So what can international community do to recover those 3 POWs who were on trial in Donbass?
The first question didn't come through quite clearly.
Were you the service person in the US? Did he understand it correctly?
Yes, I was a service member in the US. I served in the Navy and they call it the corpsman, but it's a medic. It's just a different name.
So I can answer to this. The truthful answer is that will all depend on the Russian proxies currently running the so-called DNR. We can't, I mean, at the end of the day, it will depend on the Russians. What can you do to free prisoners of war? Well, international law has a clear answer to that. There should be a prisoner exchange. That is the solution that the Geneva Conventions give. Unfortunately, when one of the parties of the conflict does not recognize the prisoner of war status of certain individuals, there is no legal construction under international law to arrange for their liberation. So my hope is that their trial was mostly for show, that this was a way for the Kremlin to increase their value in any future bargain, and that their death sentence will not be executed. That is my hope. Do I have a crystal ball? No, I can't, of course. We've heard that the lawyer for one of the 3 has already said they will appeal this decision, so hopefully that will win some time. I don't have specific information, but I very much suspect that everything is being done at the highest levels of government, both in Ukraine, but I hear also with the involvement of the UK government, to negotiate a prisoner exchange for these 3. And I very much hope that this will be successful. But as I started by answering, at the end of the day, this will all depend on the opposite side, and hopefully we'll be able to find a deal to get them out. As far as Andrew Hill is concerned, we do not have information as to how the Russian side is considering him, but we have earlier announcements from the Russian General Staff that captive legionnaires would be considered as non-prisoners of war. So we can suspect what fate awaits him. But first of all, we need proof that he's alive. We need proof that he's being treated humanely and according to the Geneva Conventions. And of course, he's a prisoner of war, and the Ukrainian authorities will do everything to have him exchanged. That is the goal, and that is the only solution that is considered under international law. So we'll be pushing for that.
Дякую. Ще питання.
Thank you. More questions?
It's about the death of Jordan Gatley. Was he serving with the International Legion? What do you know about the circumstances of his death and what he was doing at the time, who he was fighting with?
I'm afraid I can't comment this case at this time.
Was he one of yours?
I can't comment.
Дякую. Ще питання.
Sorry about that.
Kristina Atovska, North Macedonia. Speaking of international mechanisms to visit the prisoners of war and to see if they are alive and how they are treated, one Macedonian official had a proposition that maybe an international group of ombudsmen should be formed, and there should be an ombudsman for the country Russia trusts, so they can enter and see in what conditions are the prisoners of war. So have you considered something like that, to ask that kind of group to be formed, international, with ombudsmen for many more countries, in order to check the conditions of the war prisoners and, of course, maybe even to help to exchange them?
There is an authority under international law that has the competence and is supposed to check on prisoners of war, and that authority is the International Committee of the Red Cross. So what I'd like to see is for the Russian side to start working with the Red Cross. Only if that's not possible, then I'm sure that the Ukrainian authorities will be open to any sorts of solutions which in practice allow for visits to be made to prisoners of war in the occupied territories. And I'm sure the Ukrainian government will be positive to that, or well, at least I hope so. But that would be work to be done by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and that would be a question for them, the specific question that you're asking. But I'd like to underline once again, there is a competent organization to do those visits, and that organization, as per Article 126 of the Third Geneva Convention, is the Red Cross. So let's hope that the Russians can work with the International Committee of the Red Cross.
Дякую. У нас є ще питання, прошу.
From Greek television, to continue your...
Could you speak a little bit closer? I can't hear you very well.
It's okay? Do you hear me? Okay. Adamantia Lioliou from Greek television, to continue your previous answer. And so I heard also that you said that these 3 people sentenced to death have some contact with Ukrainian forces. Also, I want to ask you, if you know if there are some negotiations that are taking place for the exchange of the 3 people sentenced to prison, and at what stage are these negotiations?
I'm sorry to point this out, but I've already answered both of your questions. Yes, all 3 of them had active contracts with various units of the Ukrainian armed forces long before this new hot phase of the war started. They're not legionnaires. They've all been, as I understand, a serving member of the Ukrainian armed forces for somewhere between 1 and several years with different units. That is all in the public record. As regards any negotiations for their liberation, as I said, I don't have specific information, but I very strongly suspect that the higher echelons of the Ukrainian government are very actively working with this. I've also heard that the British government has been involved, but I'm afraid I don't have any more information. As I mentioned before, these 3 were not legionnaires, so I'm not the right instance to answer any more questions about that. If you have a follow-up, of course.
Дякую. Follow-up. Мікрофон.
As I said,
I want to clarify if you know that are there some negotiations for exchange?
that is what I suspect is taking place. I do not have specific information in this regard.
Thank you.
Ще питання, колеги?
Any more questions? Thank you for this information. Phoenix TV, I would like to ask you, you have said there are 55 countries whose volunteers take part in the Legion. Can you tell how many people are there in the International Legion fighting for Ukraine? And one more question. Who is funding this International Legion? Yeah, so first of all, we have a strict policy on the figures. And all the reporters who know me, they know that we do not comment the figures. So I cannot tell you the number of troops in the International Legion. In terms of the second question, which was about funding, yeah, the International Legion is part of the Ukrainian army, so it's funded by the Ukrainian army. And this includes all the accommodation expenses, the salaries of the fighters, the ammo and weapons. We do have some additional fundraisers to raise money from private donors, mostly from the West. So, first of all, it's raised at the West, and we collect it at different platforms through different intermediaries, and we spend it only for the equipment for our warriors, for the equipment which is not part of the standard kit issued by the Ukrainian army and which is needed in the battlefield, but which is not funded through the official army channels. So we are also raising money from private donors, amongst others, to fund the purchase of, let's say, accessoires for weapons. This is needed very often. It's the optics and other accessoires like that, and also to fund the vehicles. This is essentially the main spending lines, but mostly we are funded by the Ukrainian army. Thank you. Other questions?
Okay. As far as I know, the Russian side say that members of the Legion shouldn't be treated as prisoners of war because they're mercenaries. Do legionaries get a salary? And second question, I don't know if you can answer this. Do you know how Ukraine treats, for instance, members of the Wagner group who are fighting on the Russian side in Ukraine? Are they treated as prisoners of war, or are they treated as mercenaries?
So I'll answer your first question first. Yes, all legionnaires receive the same pay as any other servicemen of the Ukrainian armed forces. And you're absolutely right to go on this criterion first, because for the well-informed among you, you might know there is a definition of what is a mercenary under international law. It's contained in Article 47 of the first additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions. And under that provision, the motivation of a mercenary is first and foremost financial, and that mercenary should, in order to be considered as such, receive more money than the servicemen of the army that they're fighting for. Those are the main criteria under international law. Now, talking concretely about legionnaires, as I just said, we receive the same pay as any Ukrainian serviceman in the Ukrainian armed forces. Therefore, by definition, we cannot be mercenaries under international law. In addition to which, we have all the documents under Ukrainian law to prove that we are full-serving members of the Ukrainian armed forces and therefore fall under the definition of a legal combatant under Article 4 of the Third Geneva Convention. So the legal reality is very clear. The fact that the Russians are completely ignoring international law, well, that shouldn't surprise anyone, because they've been disregarding the entire body of humanitarian law ever since the war started. So it's not much of a surprise. As regards the Wagner Group, my understanding, and once again, it's very difficult to ascertain these facts, because the Wagner Group is quite, well, it's not very transparent, to say the least. But the best information I have is that combatants for the Wagner Group receive their pay from outside the Russian army, and they receive considerably more of it than servicemen in the Russian armed forces. If that information is correct, then that would make them mercenaries under Article 47 of the First Additional Protocol. And therefore, the Ukrainian authorities would not be under any obligation to treat them as prisoners of war. And here's the crux of the matter in this information war between Russia and Ukraine at the moment. Who is to be considered a mercenary? Who is to be considered a legionnaire? All of these terms have clear definitions under international law. And talking like the Russian media do and the Russian propaganda machine about legionnaires constantly as mercenaries, I mean, it's not only untrue, it simply goes against its very definition of the word. Anyone can look up in the First Additional Protocol, Article 47, that defines what a mercenary is, and if they read that article, they will understand that we're not mercenaries. So it's pure propaganda. As far as the Wagner Group is concerned, I'll say this. I am unaware personally, because for my role I don't have such information, but I am unaware what their current treatment is, if any of them are in captivity. But my position as a lawyer would be that they're not to be considered as prisoners of war, because as far as I understand, they receive salary from outside the Russian army and for considerably more money.
Дякую. Ще питання, колеги?
Any more questions?
We don't often... Yes.
How can you make a difference, Ukrainian government, how can make difference, how can prove that some of the Russian soldiers who are in captivation now are mercenaries and the other one are part of Russian army? Is there a way to prove that which one of them are mercenaries in order to be treated like prisoners of war?
Sure, it's very simple. It's funny because in this role I'm feeling more and more that my role as a teacher of humanitarian law is coming out. So a prisoner of war should be able to state their full name, their service number, and the unit in which they serve. That is the only, those are the only requirements that apply to a combatant that is taken into captivity in order to have the prisoner of war status. If those, let's say, Wagner group members, without using any other, let's say, term, fall into captivity and are able to cite a service number of the Russian army and a unit number of a unit that they serve in the Russian military, then they'll be entitled to prisoner of war status, and I'm sure the Ukrainian authorities will treat them as such. If they are, as we suspect, acting there as private military contractors, then they won't be able to cite a unit in which they serve because they're not part of the Russian military and they won't have a service number, and therefore they might not be treated as prisoners of war. If there is any uncertainty about the status of a particular prisoner, then he shall be treated as a prisoner of war until such time as his situation and his status can be clarified. This is all in the Geneva Conventions. I'm not inventing it. The problem in this war is that there is only one side that respects the Geneva Convention, and the other one doesn't care about it.
Дам'єне, Глено, я дуже дякую.
Damian, Glena, thank you so much for finding time and joining us. I really appreciate what you're doing, and thanks to all the international legionnaires for helping us fight for our freedom and democracy. Thank you, and glory to Ukraine.